All right, it's Thursday at 4:20 p.m. Eastern. That means it's time for Office Hours, AROYA's weekly session for cultivators to hear from the experts and talk to each other about what they're seeing with their grows. My name is Cation. I'll be co-moderating today with my good friend Mandy. How you doing, Mandy?
Hey, Keisha. Glad to be here for episode 34. Oh my gosh. We're also live over there on YouTube. So I'll be monitoring for questions as those roll in. And as always, if you're live here with us, you can ask a question at any time in our chat. If your question is chosen, we'll go ahead and have you unmute yourself and ask away. One more quick mention, AROYA is now on TikTok. They let me start a TikTok. So be sure to follow us if you're over there. And completely, you're going to have completely new content over there. Crop steering education, fun stuff. It's going to be completely new. So we had a lot of questions submitted on TikTok and Instagram this week. So I'll go ahead and pass it back to the lovely Keisha.
Amazing, Mandy. Thank you so much. It is on and popping here. We're going to get started, but real quick, if you're a first-time question asker, you may win some swag. You just drop your email address into the chat. If you haven't won before, one winner per household, limiting that to U.S. residents only. Let's get the party started. Seth and Jason, how you guys doing today?
Doing well.
Good. How are you, Keisha?
Doing good. Thank you, guys. Good to see you. All right. Our first deep dive, we're going to start with that. We got some interesting feedback from client visits here. And so we thought we'd cover this for a few minutes on this week's episode. So what do you guys think people need to know when they're trying to switch out or change their substrates? What kind of things are you seeing with client visits, and what recommendations would you make for that?
I think probably the first transition that people have been making, and I think a lot of people have already made that, it's going from more traditional substrates, something like peat or perlite mixed type of soilless substrate, into probably cocoa is usually their first step. One of the reasons that that's a nice kind of intermediary step to rock wool would be the fact that it is slightly more forgiving than rock wool. I like to always kind of think about, cocoa as the SUV of the market, and then rock wool is kind of a sports car, where we really need to make sure that we've got all our other systems in play in order to work with rock wool very well. So yeah, I think a lot of people in this point, or at least in the transitionary point to moving from cocoa possibly into rock wool, if they're indoor. I see a lot of greenhouses, they've gotten really good results with cocoa. They're at the point where environment sometimes not controllable enough to really want to make that next step. And so, that's kind of where we're at across the board in the industry. You see a ton of people use rock wool simply because it is so reactive when we steer it. And so if they've got their irrigation scheduling set up really well, you make sure they're not having any clogging products in their drip lines. If they are using a monitoring system, so they can make sure that their drybacks are what they should be in rock wool. Those are kind of the first steps right now. And I think we'll deep dive a little bit here more into some of the scientific aspects of those medias, but let's hear from Seth.
Yeah. I think one of the big things people need to look at too is, media size, and look at, what kind of saturation, what kind of volumetric water content can I get in that media? Because if you're going to switch, you want to switch to a media that serves your purposes better than what you have. If your pot's currently too big, maybe you need to go from a 3.5 gallon down to a 1.5 or 2 gallon, just to be able to steer the same size plant in the ways that we want to. We also need to look at, what kind of consistency are we going to have? A big reason to move from cocoa to rock wool is that simply consistency. With cocoa, every time as I'm using it, I'm always looking at where my water, where I get runoff at, and where I want to bottom out at. And that's always going to change a little bit. With rock wool, I can consistently, pretty much always count on a very similar level of saturation, at least at runoff. So as long as our field capacity, is stable, that makes it way, way easier run to replicate the same irrigation strategies.
Kind of just thinking of some of the reasons that people do it without even thinking about the plant output would just be the logistical aspects of moving to something like a pre-bagged, unhydrated, the dried out cocoa bags, 1 gallon, 2 gallon. Those are an awesome media. They're usually pretty consistent as long as you stick with the same supplier. They're fairly eco-friendly. Cocoa is great. I use it in my garden fairly consistently. And then space constraints, that compressed cocoa blocks are really easy to store, maybe even more so than rock wool. But rock wool is, it's ready to use, unlike a lot of the bagged soilless products that we used to mix and throw into hard pots back in the day. So we can save a lot of bit of labor. We can definitely increase the cleanliness of our facilities by switching to some of the more modern medias. And they're a little bit easier to use. So as long as you can find a good, reliable source and you have a little bit of room to store those prepackaged products, it's a nice way to streamline your transplant procedures and make sure that you are having consistent results run to run.
Yeah, and honestly, that commercial availability, can you continue to get that product? It's a big part of that choice, I think. I know we work with people in various parts of the country that just have supply chain issues. The distributors that are in their area are having trouble keeping a certain brand of cocoa in stock or certain size slab in stock. So a big part of it going forward too is like, hey, is it better to choose a product that I can get a hold of and see how I can adjust my growing style to use that? Or if I found this really niche product that does work perfect for me, but might not be able to get it when I need it, and I can't, let's say I don't have, the space or money to buy 5 runs ahead, that's going to be a factor for sure. I know in my experience, having that same problem, you kind of end up, especially in the cocoa world, if you're not buying ahead, you're going to be jumping around brand to brand, size to size all the time if you're running into, an issue with supply chain problems. And that's not something you want to be running into, because now every time you get one dialed, you get a run or two and then you switch again, and it just makes life tough. So you really want to look at, not only what are we looking for in perfection with production, but what is the most efficient in our specific facility.
Yeah, and so those are some of the operational aspects to think about and consider before you do make that transition. Let's dive into some of the scientific, the cultivation aspects of how we can make sure our plants are getting the best crop health possible when we do transition that. So, and you guys will hear me talk about these properties quite a bit in any of our open office hour sessions, and that is cation exchange capacity and matrix potential. So these are products of any type of media. A lot of times we'll think about the spectrum of complete living soil on one side, and then something very inert like rock wool on the other side of the spectrum. And we talk about cation exchange capacity, sometimes you'll see it abbreviated CEC, and that's basically a reference onto how much does that substrate hang on to the nutrients in solution. And so, based on the ion interactions between the water solution, the fertigation solution, and the type of particles in that substrate, sometimes the nutrients are going to be held in suspension in that media for a longer duration. So on rock wool, it's very reactive, meaning that when we apply a new nutrient solution, the substrate has very little holding capacity to the nutrients, if you will. I'm not sure I really like that terminology, but basically what happens in something like living soil, if we think about like clay, for example, it's definitely going to hang on to some of those nutrients simply because of the interaction between the fertigation and the substrate particles. So that would be covering, CEC. So let's just go over the most common interactions, maybe moving from something like cocoa to rock wool. And if we think about cocoa, it does have some amount of cation exchange holding capacity. And so when we actually charge that up with, if we were at a zero EC fertigation, a lot of times I'll see my cocoa in at that 1.0 EC range, and depending on supplier, it could be anything from probably, I'm throwing numbers out there, 0.8 to maybe up to 1.5, depending on who you get that from and how long it's been since it was washed and that type of stuff. So if we were moving into rock wool, we want to make sure that we are monitoring our substrate EC and our runoff EC very closely until we get adjusted to the new substrate. Something like rock wool is going to have a very low EC right off the bat. Really even the first time you wash it, you might see some funny numbers simply because of the wetting agent that is impregnated in a lot of rock wools. So do keep that in mind as well. Get that stuff soaked through and then do a runoff with your normal feed levels and see, hey, are we, a point or a point and a half above below what we would expect when we were running in cocoa. And maybe we'll just jump into thinking about matrix potential as well. And this kind of comes back to the analogy I was speaking it to, where cocoa is a little bit more forgiving than something like rock wool. So if we've been running cocoa for a while and we've been monitoring and we've got our shots, right in line, and we don't have too many equipment failures that would run us into some crop, some monetary jeopardy, losing value because of the health of the plant, if we had some failures or clogged emitters, that type of stuff. So when we are going into something like rock wool, if we drop our water contents too low, we can definitely run into some hydrophobic properties being developed. And that's why it is shipped with that wetting agent, so that it can be stored dry and yet retain its properties when it's first irrigated, when it's first wet up. Those wetting agents get dissolved throughout the substrate, and they're no longer in there to protect it from over drying out. And that's when you'll see nutrient channeling, irrigation funneling, that type of stuff. And you go back in our office hours and check out the kitchen spun analogy that I talk about, where we want to make sure we're dripping nice and slow. Obviously, if we had some channeling in there, they'd be dry splotches that we could see if we were looking inside of that slab. So that matrix potential basically means that, in rock wool, the plant is not going to feel much irrigation stress or drought stress, as would be the terminology from traditional agriculture. And what happens is that matrix potential, meaning how much the plants have to apply vacuum to the substrate in order to pull the water out of the substrate. The plants don't have to pull much vacuum in order to pull that rock wool all the way to pretty much zero water content. And when we look at the matrix potential curves of something like cocoa, and this is one of the reasons it is a little bit more forgiving as well, is when we hit that about 25% range, and depending on manufacturer again, but there's going to be a little bit of an inflection point, an elbow on that matrix potential curve. And what that means is the plants are going to have to apply significantly more vacuum in order to get lower than say 20%, right? So how much vacuum they had to apply between 30 and 20 might be quite a bit less than what they have to apply between, say, 20 and 10% water content. And so one of the things is you have a visual indicator on the plant before it's actually in a point at which it could theoretically really die. So it's going to feel some type of drought stress if we're using cocoa when we run into the really low water contents like that.
That's a great overview, you guys. Thank you so much. Michael, who's on here live with us today, posted a comment and a question. He wrote here, the 6x6 cocoa cubes are pretty uniform. I didn't know if you guys wanted to speak to that before I ask his question. Or before, Michael, you can ask your question too if you'd like to unmute yourself. Poor signal. Been there. Yes. Okay. So here's actually his question. What are the differences in ceilings and floors for water content and EC in the two substrates?
A little bit different manufacturer, and I'm just going to talk about, before we run into any drying out issues or whatever. So when we're first wetting things out, with rock wool slab, we usually see our field capacity anywhere between, say, 65 and 75% would be the typical numbers that I'm used to seeing with a rock wool slab from the most popular vendors. And cocoa's, I think it's a little bit wider range, just because we've got some that are more pithy, some that are more chunky, and even some vendors that offer different types of blends. I actually just got some samples in the other day, and they stage it in layers where they've got a little bit more of the pith up top and the chunk down bottom, just to try and attribute the way that the water pushes those particles down into that product. And so it's probably, say field capacity about 50%, plus or minus 15.
If you got any perlite in there, down into the 30s. I would say for most commercial products out there, anywhere between about 42. And I've seen some that do go up to like 70, 75.
Yeah.
So it's highly variable, but that's part of why that supply chain security is so essential, because once you've locked in a certain media, like the product you were talking about, I would not want to switch immediately from that to something that is just a straight cocoa or a different mix right away. At least that would be pretty inconvenient, because that's a pretty specific growing substrate. If I'm dealing with those layers, I've kind of tuned how I know the sensor readings are going to be to that media. I've gotten used to it in a lot of ways, and there's a few key differences that one would have that others don't, especially when we're talking about water holding capacity throughout the day. So
yeah, that's actually
consistent.
A great question to bring up when we're talking about transitioning from a media, because one of the first things that you will want to do is get your sensors in there and check out what you're expecting to be your field capacity at. So to do that initial saturation and watch those closely until you see some runoff and say, all right, well, usually when I'm hitting 58% with this media, then I'll expect some runoff. And that's one way to kind of help yourself familiarize when you're adjusting your graphs, because if I moved from cocoa to Rockwell and I tried to run the exact same AROYA recipe graph, things probably wouldn't be as happy as they possibly could be.
Well, you'd certainly have a lot of challenges replicating that, day to day immediately. Your irrigation schedules wouldn't work. And Mike, in terms of EC, no matter what substrate we're using, we're going to go by plant health indicators to look at that. So if we've got a plant that's deficient for certain things, we might be increasing the EC. And at certain times, particularly when applying generative stress, we do want to increase that EC, because that's also helping us apply some generative stress to the plant. But as far as a floor and a ceiling, typically, if you're all the way down at what your feed EC is, you might be seeing some deficiencies. I would call that a hard floor. And then the ceiling, usually once we start to see plants peaking up above 15, up near 20, that's when we'll start to see some leaf burn and signs that there's a little bit too much osmotic pressure on those plants.
Yeah, and one thing to keep in mind too is when Seth's talking about that, 20 is a reasonable ceiling. This is going to be a peak right before your irrigations on the next day. So we're checking out that time series data and thinking about how long is it spending in this amount of EC range. And obviously, it's one of the ways that we can make sure that our crop steering is working is by applying that osmotic or reducing that osmotic differential when we increase our EC.
Yep. And then remember, your plants are always, especially if you're trying to run generative, and especially if you've been in a big media before where that's all you were running, your plants are always exposed to a range in EC. So when we're looking at EC, there really is never one value for any part of the growth phase. There's an expected range that we would like to see. And when you go out of that range above it, a lot of times that's simply a result of over drying. So on that one event, is the high EC hurting the plant, or is the low water content hurting the plant? Well, the reality is the plant's just using too much energy to try to uptake water. So that's what's causing damage. And we need to remedy that by not over drying, rather than looking at the EC and going, well, that's why I got, some herms in week 7 was at EC. It's like, well, maybe, but if it's just spiking at the end of the day, it might be because it's getting real dry and that plant's like kind of dying. We're putting way too much drought stress on it and actually damaging its health.
Yeah. And, thinking about where we've come from with nutrients, I've worked with a lot of people that get a little bit shy of running as high in nutrients as some of the modern 2-part salts recommend. And fortunately, we're in a day and age where there has been a pretty significant increase in the quality of products that we can get for nutrients from these vendors. Maybe not so if we were mixing from raw chemicals ourselves, but as far as a lot of the 2 parts, they're pretty well balanced in their nutrients. And so we're able to run higher ECs than we used to be comfortable with.
Oh yeah. And then, when we go back and talk about cation exchange capacity as well, historically, like before I ever grew soilless, even growing field crops and stuff, we're still using salt fertilizer. But what we're contending with there is how is that interacting with the soil? And in a mineral-based soil, we've got the ability for certain compounds, certain nutrients to be held in the soil and still accessible to the plants, depending on the soil type. Other soil types we're going to have, and certain pHs, nutrients that are held to that soil but not plant accessible. So especially if you've been growing only in a soilless media the whole time, you might not be quite familiar with the idea that you're going to change your feed ranges feed ranges or push them so high. However, like if you were growing in, certain field agriculture applications and you go from, more of a silty loam to a heavy clay soil, you're used to making those changes and saying, okay, it's not just about what the plants need. It's more about, we're working with osmotic energy and working with what's actually available to the plant.
Michael, you'll have to let us know if that answered everything that was in your question. But we're getting a ton of questions over on YouTube, so I'm going to go ahead and ask a couple of those. Diane wrote in and wants to know, if I'm in week 8 and I figured out I have mold because of VPD at 0.65, and I figured out it's a mistake, if I raise my VPD to 1.4, will it slow down the molding process?
It'll slow it down. Yeah. Obviously, once the mold spores are already growing, there's not much you can do to go back. That's why we really encourage as much preventative integrated pest management as possible, is because you can keep them from growing, but once they're growing, all you can do is kill them, and there's still going to be mold on the product.
Yep. One of the biggest things too is starting to identify how your different strains present that they have mold. For a lot of them, that bud will start to look just a little bit drier. You might see some leaf tips, but you can learn to identify it before you actually have to crack into those buds and spread spores around the room to find it. That's a big part. And then really, you've got to be vigilant about your VPD, like late flower, week 7 and 8, even at night, dipping down below a 1.0 or a 1.1, you're probably going to have mold. Even if you do it for 2 hours, it's going to allow those spores to germinate. And then once it's growing, you've got to think the inside of that bud is never nearly as dry as the air around it. And once it becomes wet in there, we can't really do much to dry it out. You might have noticed, like if you've ever got condensation that drips onto a plant, you can put a fan right in front of there if you fix it and try to get that bud dried out. But once it's bad enough for long enough, it's just going to stay moldy. There's no bringing it back. You've just got to correct it on the next run and probably do a lot of scrubbing in between now and then.
Every run is a learning experience. Diane, thank you so much for your question. We have so many questions coming in. We got Bilbo on with us. You posted a question. You want to go ahead and ask it?
Okay. Back to substrates. Let's consider the amount and how long different substrates take to achieve runoff. You guys recently spoke to mold and VPD. So is it reasonable to assume that the resulting moisture event from irrigation, whether that be transpiration, evapotranspiration, or the irrigation fluid on the table under different substrates, will act differently and influence the environmental variables also equally differently?
Maybe slightly. This is one of those where you're just going to have to take a lot of variables into play. What type of HVAC equipment are you running? Are you running slopes on your environmental changes, on your lighting changes? How big is the room? What's your plant spacing? Your total biomass? As far as the actual amount that the substrate might play into it, probably not as much as the other factors that we could take a look at first.
I'll tell you one big factor. Slabs versus open top pots.
Oh, yeah.
There you go. If you've got open top media, you're going to have greater evaporation. But other than that, whether it's rock wool or cocoa, we're talking still about two media that have very low matrix potential. So the VPD is going to be what drives transpiration and evaporation in the environment much more than the media. Now, if your media is too small or too big, if you put a lot of water into the room onto a big media size, you're going to have a lot more evaporation over time, obviously. And it's going to be, not a consistent rate. It's probably going to speed up more and more as that pot gets drier.
Is the answer then yes? It is something that we should consider if someone's.
So basically, you're not going to change your VPD for any specific type of media. As far as your environment goes, you want to keep it well within established parameters. What you don't want to do is, think that, the only thing I could think that you would want to change there is if your pots are too small and you're drying out too fast, you might consider lowering your VPD if you're up at let's say 1.7, 1.8, trying to finish some big nugs. But other than that, those two media are going to behave very similarly in terms of moisture events.
Yeah, so evaporation is just going to be a factor of the exposed substrate or other wet products in the room. The more surface area we have exposed, the more evaporation we're going to see from those products.
Yeah, so like open top fabric pots, you've got your media surrounded by a wick. You're going to have a little bit more evaporation there compared to, say, a slab. Same if you're running like the GR40s, that's an open top, bigger unislab type product. But yeah, otherwise, always going to keep your VPD within ranges and then watch how your media reacts, and smaller pot sizes are going to dry out faster. EC is going to rise quicker in those. That's the biggest difference.
Thanks, Bilbo. It's always good to see you. We're going to move on back to some of the YouTube questions that we got. Diane wrote in, this is a defoliation question. If I defoliate 5 days before harvest, is that going to help me ripen my plants or slow them down? I want to do it because I can't lower my humidity. What are your opinions?
Well, if you want to do it because you can't lower your humidity, it's probably the only option and the right option. If you're going to be just losing some bud to mold, that's the absolute worst case, right? If you're slowing your ripening down just a slight amount, that's not nearly as bad as throwing product out.
Yeah, absolutely. And in that case, the biggest thing you want to be careful for is not to get too greedy when you're trying to take those leaves. Try to focus on just the fan leaves, any leaves that has a petiole, which is the stem of the leaf that connects the base of the leaflets to the stem of the plant. Cut that with scissors or snips. Don't grab those and pop them off the stem and damage the base of the bud right before you cut it down. I've found when in the past, if I'm working with people and they're really, not wanting to use the scissors or just getting too aggressive with it, we'll find mold either right before we cut down or in the drying room at those wound sites. But if you can cut that petiole, that will naturally dry back into a little twig almost, and you'll avoid that problem completely.
So many good questions coming in. We have another one from Bilbo. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay. I want to talk about bricks measurements. It's used in lots of different other kinds of agriculture, food products. I want to know if you guys have any experience taking these readings, when they matter more. We do have an instrument on site, but no tests have been taken thus far. And if you can shed some light on that would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, bricks, we're talking about sugar concentration in the plant tissue. How much sugar is there? Typically, when I'm looking at cannabis, towards the end, when we have a product we're about to bring down, we don't want a lot of sugar in it. However, that being said, I haven't seen a lot of research relating specifically to cannabis and the buds. One thing it can be used for is an indication of how much your plant's photosynthesizing and how healthy it is. But I will say I don't have any specific values that I can give to you, much like using a leaf parameter. Those would be values that I'd want to establish in my facility and compare, okay, what's a healthy plant look like? What's a weak plant look like? All right, we switched this fertilizer. We're seeing higher sugar production in weeks 1 through 5. That's a sign that maybe we're getting better performance out of this fertilizer. But as far as bricks goes, generally it's used to indicate quality in a lot of different fruit crops.
How was the test performed in cannabis flower? Or, as I understand, it's just grind up some leaves, get a drop it onto the refractometer lens, I guess you would call it, and let the reading happen. Is that what you understand?
Yeah. And personally, I don't think it would work that well with finished buds. I don't know how well you're going to, if that's going to work quite that well with trichromes and oils and stuff floating around in there.
It suggests to take the leaf. Is that something that makes sense to you?
Yeah, but it's not like the biggest indicator I would look at. Like I said, when we're looking at other crops, we're looking at things that we want sugar production in. When I'm looking at bricks levels in grapes, that's a direct indicator of quality. I'll use grapes as an example, same with blueberries. If I want to have a good bricks level, a good amount of sugar in there, I'm going to be applying the right kind of generative stress to make sure that plant is focusing on fruit production. And that bricks level is going to tell me I achieved that goal. We're looking for THC, not sugar. So if you want to use it as an indicator for plant growth, that's useful. I wouldn't say it compares. There's a direct comparison between bricks levels and quality in cannabis.
Amazing. Debunked. Thank you.
There's merit to paying attention. It's another stream of data that you can look at, right? You can say, okay, I've got a plant that's making more sugar. It's healthier. That's what photosynthesis does. But again, like if you were to use it on buds, to me, more sugar means more stuff that you don't want to burn that's residually left over in that bud. So is it useful? Maybe. I think we have better indicators like water activity and potency to go by than Brix level. And then also at the end of the day, there's consumer demand, we can put out water activity tests, potency tests, cannabinoid tests. And at the end of the day, it's how well the consumer enjoys it. If it has still at the end of the day does it have a good nose? Does it smoke well?
I love these discussions. Oh my gosh, we're learning so much. Bilbo, you'll have to let us know if you have any follow-up questions. But yeah, we're going to go ahead and get back to some of our questions that we have in the chat. Diane, yours is up next. Do you want to take yourself off mute and go ahead and ask the guys, or I can ask for you? I can definitely ask for you. So what's better, ammonium nitrogen or nitrate nitrogen, and how can I use them?
So ammonium's not very plant mobile. You want to go with calcium nitrate, potassium nitrate. There's several forms of nitrate you can use. If you're asking this question, I would probably just stick with a tried and true fertilizer brand rather than trying to supplement your own nitrate. Like if we're talking about ammoniacal nitrogen, that's not always the easiest product to just go buy in a level that you want to use it in your grow. And it might require some hazmat licensing to handle. So useful, yes. Ammoniacal nitrogen, it's been a cheap product for over 100 years in agriculture. Nitrate, that's what you want. It's plant mobile. So if you're looking at a nutrient line that may not be, let's say, marketed specifically for cannabis and it has high ammoniacal nitrogen, you're probably wasting a little bit of money in terms of the weight in that fertilizer bag.
Diane, save that money and let us know if you have any follow-up. Post it in the chat, okay? We're going to move on. We have so many questions. Husky posted a question here. They would like to know, can you ask from, I don't have to read that part. Some advocate keeping the same day and night temps to avoid humidity spike. How do you feel about such practices in terms of crop steering and plant signaling?
Yeah, so we covered this one pretty well in detail, I think 2 or 3 episodes ago. My general rule of thumb is always pay attention to your strains. What kind of expression are you trying to get out of that strain? And if, we're shooting for middle of the road, I like to break it into thirds where, the first third of flower, I run a 0 nighttime diff in the temperature. For the second third of flower, I'll go for somewhere around 5 degree diff. And then for maybe the last third, I'll go for a 10 degree diff. And that, that's basically knowing nothing about the genetics or the facility constraints, right? So anytime that we're making those, we don't have any visibility on the variables that you're working with. So I'm really glad that you talked about, keeping humidity spikes down. A lot of times it's actually related to other things in there. So when we think about fluctuation in the temperature, sure, your relative humidity might have some changes, but your absolute humidity is not necessarily going to be affected by the temperature. What it is affected by is turning lights on or turning lights off. When we think about an HPS room, those HPS lights are generating a lot of heat and they burn off quite a bit of humidity. So one of the most common humidity spikes that we'll see in charting is right after lights off. And there's usually a fairly easy first step to try and avoid that. And that is kick your dehumidifier on for 30 minutes or an hour before your lights off. And rather than seeing a big spike, you'll just get a drop and a blip, trying to offset what's going to go on in that room. So use your time series data and some of your control logics to try and work best for your plants.
Yeah. You really nailed it there, Jason. We've got, our third system as far as 0, 5, and 10 degree diffs. However, I would say at least 50% of the growers when I first start talking to them, as we get later into flower, they are unable to keep up with the humidity with a 10 degree overnight diff. So most of the time when we're looking at that, it's really what can your facility tolerate? And are you willing to make a choice between, especially depending on the genetics, you're going to know your genetics more than Jason or I do for sure if you run them several times. But do you want purple or do you want mold? moldy purple weed is not generally that desirable, if so that's what we got to look at the end of the day.
Bilbo Baggins, I'm going to go ahead and ask for you. Bilbo wants to know, how early can a water activity reading be useful?
So when product goes into a dry room, usually that water activity is going to be in the 0.99. So, I mean, it's about as wet as you can read anything. I would still recommend, taking readings that first day. So, probably no later than 12 hours after it's been in there that you could start getting useful readings. If you want them to be really useful, take them from the beginning and see when it does drop off 0.99. Do you go to 0.98 in 3 hours? Does another, maybe a smaller nugged product go to 0.96 in 3 hours? So I guess the answer there is it's dependent. It's going to take a little bit of time for those things to begin drying out. If it's helpful for you to know when they absolutely begin drying out, then take them immediately and start logging those. But as a general rule of thumb, I usually just like to have one water activity reading a day until we've got things kind of dialed in for that dry room and that cultivar.
Yeah, I mean, the first time you're using it, I think it's great to take quite a few readings the first couple of days, just so you can establish when you don't want to see a flat line. We want to see a steady decline. That being said, if you're in there every half hour taking one, you might just be putting on a lot of miles, way more than you need to. So breaking it up into 1 or 2 times a day at first, and then seeing, okay, all right, there's 4 hours in between each of those readings, or 6 or 8. How much of a decline did I see? Is it enough that I'm actually going to capture any moisture loss in between there to make it worth sampling? And then, like I said, establishing, okay, if I know we're going to have quality problems if we see it go down to a certain number too early, or if we stay above, like, let's say 0.9 for 48 hours, I might be getting worried that it's molding in there. Something might be broke. So as much as you want, but just kind of like if you're running around with the Solus out there checking it, guys, the more the better. But you've got to try to find that balance between what actually works for you operationally and what is going to get you to where you need to be in terms of what you're trying to do.
Yeah, and this kind of brings up an interesting thing that I was curious about when I first got into cannabis, and that was, well, if we want to dry faster, can't we just drop our humidities in the room quite a bit and dry that thing out faster and turn it over? And a couple things can happen there, and that is one, jeopardizing some of the quality, some of the terpene and the smell profiles that we get off of that. And then another that is less obvious is you can actually build a water barrier, and so the outside of the bud will dry, and since there's the bud is no longer homogeneous, the inside is going to have a harder time drying simply because the outside is crusted over, if you will, and so that's a drying barrier that you definitely want to avoid.
Yeah, and that's a good point. If you over dry too quickly, you're looking at risking, again, we're always talking about mold, but mold later down the line in your curing buckets. No one wants that in the bins. And then also we got to remember too, we want it to be a very steady decline, just because that homogenization is super important. The bud needs to, slowly dry so that certain compounds like sugars, a whole host of other volatile compounds can slowly break down before we get to the point where we go into that final cure. And then, that's a big part of when we look at like weed that grew, looked great, comes out without a good nose, smokes really harsh. A lot of that's just drying down way too quick and not allowing the bud to homogenize and cure properly.
All about that consumption experience at the end of the day, right? Consumer experience. All right. Going to keep it going here. Michael dropped a question in the chat. Want to go ahead and ask that for him. Do you find any benefit in changing the food balance throughout flowering, like more nitrogen in the first few weeks and heavy PK at finish? Or has crop searing eliminated the need for those changes?
It just depends on how much flexibility you have at your site. If I'm running 5 rooms or more maybe even if I'm just running 3 rooms off one dosers, one set of dosers, or I'm using a batch tank for mixed rooms, and I don't have the flexibility to fluctuate my nutrient balance. Sometimes it's not worth it, right? Obviously, if we think about early on when we're using a veg formula, it is definitely going to be higher in something like nitrogen, and a lot of the flowering formulas that we see nowadays are actually already very, very low in nitrogen. And so it's something where you just have to consider how much complexity that you want to involve and how much value can you gain by involving that.
Yeah. Highly strain dependent and equipment dependent. If your situation is you've got one injection system for all your flower rooms and you don't have the ability to change that between room, most of the single mix recipes out there today, a lot of the nutrients around, I don't even have to name them. Guess what? They work great for probably 80 to 90% of strains out there. When you find ones that don't work in that, you can consider that fertilizer. I mean, you've made an investment. You've bought a part of your system. So economically, you always want to consider if I have to really treat this thing tough, is it worth it to make all these changes? And then also the other side of it is, it's amazing at how different plants just respond to different EC levels. I've definitely been in a situation chasing my tail thinking, man, I got to throw CalMag at this. I got to throw a sulfur supplement, everything I can think of. Next round, just raise the EC in the pot by 2 or 3 points on the range. And it's beautiful. It's no more toxicities. And I didn't change the fertilizer. So, I mean, that's also why going back to tissue analysis is good. And then, as far as traditional fertilizer mixes before we got into commercial cannabis cultivation, as big as it is now, oftentimes did drop out nitrogen for the most part for the last few weeks of flower. And part of that was because it was a necessity for some of those boutique strains that are notoriously difficult to grow. What we found in plant science, though, is that most cultivars are only going to uptake what they want. So some plants will have a tendency to preferentially uptake nitrogen late in flower, but by and large, they take what they want. And that EC balance has a lot more to do with how we've built it over time and what we have available to the plant than oftentimes what the plants might actually be missing.
Awesome. Thank you guys for that. Michael, you'll have to let me know if you have any follow-up with that. Diane, I'm going to ask yours next. Diane wants to know, are there any benefits from amino acids in hydroponics, for example? Does it open more calcium ion channels at the roots and stimulate them to uptake more calcium, or is that a wrong theory?
I honestly couldn't dive deep enough here without looking up some stuff to come back with you on that one. I think there has been benefits shown in organic agriculture for amino acids, especially look at JDAM or like the fish amino acid mixes and things like that. However, you've got to balance that with the fact that most of those supplements aren't going to work in a drip system. Generally speaking, they clog it up. And the other reality is that if you're getting, just like anything, if you can try around with amino acids and somehow, you're not going to plug everything up or you're going to get your irrigation equipment to last, is that improvement, what do you see? Are we seeing grams per square foot? Are we seeing quality? In my experience, I've never been able to narrow it down to it being one particular supplement usually that did something for me. It's always a holistic approach.
Great. Thank you for that. Diane, let us know if you have any other questions related to that. Bilbo posted a great question. It goes back a few minutes when you guys were talking about the drying, the importance of the drying process. He wrote, how should I dry with an aqua lab?
So I'll just take the hands-on approach here. And what you want to do is, think about some of the variances in your dry room, including your genetic variances, and try to get a representative sample from each of those different, possibly, one zone's a little bit drier than the other, or some cultivars have really large, dense buds and some are more popcorny. So, make sure that you are getting enough samples that are going to represent what you're trying to look at in there. Take that bud and you can just kind of cut it up into a few pieces. I always recommend using scissors rather than grinders, just because a grinder can kind of powder it and give you a little bit unrepresentative, it's probably okay as long as you are always grinding and using that as your reference procedure. But I prefer scissors just to cut it up into 4 or 8 chunks that fit into the Aqua Lab. Take 1 or 2 samples every day, document those so that you know with the variables, hey, this is from, the top left corner of the dry room, and it was some, Blue Dream or whatever type of genetic that it is, and keep taking those samples every day until, you're ready to pull it. And you might say, all right, well, for our Blue Lab, we're at, 12 days, or Blue Dream, we're at 12 days, is where we hit that perfect. And, then sometimes once you're really getting better, like, all right, we need it just slightly wetter than we are at 12 days. Let's shoot for 11 and a half with this specific setup. And, there might be other cultivars that you can pull down, out of there faster as well, and that can really help your processing workflow. You think about moving the product out that does dry a little bit faster, and it can help your team know where we want to begin in that room, and when, as we are working throughout the day, is where we want to end up.
Awesome. I love talking about the Aqua Lab. It's one of my favorite products. Bilbo had another question, and I'm going to go ahead and ask for him. And I think that this opens us up to a little bit of a discussion, but let me know. Isn't strain, like the word strain, isn't that terminology for bacteria? How did that word end up being used in the culture?
It's also a term for when I work too hard.
I think that just kind of goes back to the days, because even if we look at some of the growing books and stuff out of like the late 70s, early 80s, there were some serious horticulturalists that were using, the terms cultivar and variety correctly. Personally, I think strain kind of dates back to, the underground when we had people throwing out names like AK-47 and 9-pound hammer and strains that sounded mean. On the same vein, strain sounds a little cooler than cultivar. When you go shopping at the tree nursery, you see cultivars when you're looking at apples. Well, weed isn't apples, so we wanted our own little term for it. I think is about how far that goes, and it stuck. It rolls off the tongue a little nicer than cultivar, and it's here to stay. Is what I've learned over the past few years. I can definitely tell you that.
We've seen sometimes in our system cultivar is misread, and some people think it's cultivator, and they'll put their own name in rather than the strain name, if you will. So we've definitely experienced some of the terminology. We obviously wanted to attribute it with the as scientific as possible approach, but even in today's, I hear strain probably 80% of the time compared to any other terminology that can be used for it. So.
And that's also embedded, I think, with a lot of people outside of agriculture, because they're used to talking about, the most recent being different strains of COVID, different mutations and stuff. We're used to hearing that term when we're talking about different, distinct genetic lines of something.
Awesome. Well, we're going to go ahead down our list because we're getting close to the end of our show. Diane had another question. Thank you for these, by the way. If I increase my PPFD to 1700, is it going to make my plants produce smaller fan leaves? That's going to make my light penetration deeper in the canopy, and potentially I will have the lower buds bigger. Am I right?
Probably not going to produce smaller fan leaves. It's very likely going to produce bigger fan leaves. As that plant's getting more energy, it's going to grow a little bit faster and possibly a little bit bigger in that time frame. That being said, if you are up in that type of very high light range, at least for indoor type of cultivation, you might have more light penetration deeper simply because you have so much more light coming to the top of the canopy, and that could possibly make your lower buds bigger, denser, any of that type of stuff.
Yeah. And then also, at a certain point, you've got to accept the reality that there is shade deeper in your canopy. And no matter what, if you leave lower buds on past a certain point, you're going to have a quality difference, between them and what's above. So if I spend too much time worrying about those lower buds and stripping upper fan leaves, I'm just taking away food from the more quality buds that I want to bulk up. So really for you, finding that line of where like, hey, if I leave buds below this point, quality suffers. And I don't like that. That's probably the best approach. If you're in a situation where you need, 20 or 30% of your product to go for joints or small buds for whatever reason, that's a different conversation. But at the same time, we're still probably not going to put a lot of effort into opening it up at the expense of other buds. We can get rid of fan leaves, but once we start getting rid of bud leaves, then we're really cutting into our yield.
Yeah, there's some interesting things that people try to increase the light down below, and obviously things like having lighter colored or white walls, white floor, those are always just going to naturally help the reflection of light in the room. It's a pretty easy way to sometimes cut costs and stuff, and then I think sometimes and more recently we've seen some people running in canopy lighting. I don't necessarily have any feedback on what that looks like these days, but I have seen it out there.
One of the coolest recent studies I've seen that it's not nearly finished yet. It's some armchair studies. Some people I know that are playing with PPFD meters, but playing with light spacing and height with some of these higher PPFD capable lights, where they're finding that if they can pull the light up a little bit and crank it, they actually get a better angle coming out of the fixture, and they're getting better penetration, not by blasting it straight down, but adjusting the geometry of which way their light comes from. And that way they're getting, instead of this bud blocking this bud, now the light's coming down into an angle and it can hit the lower buds. So we're starting to see some of that. The easiest way to dial that obviously is with spreadsheets and a PPFD meter. But there's starting to be better solutions for that. But at the end of the day, we've always, like I said, go back to establishing your ideal canopy depth to maintain the quality that you want.
Awesome. Thank you guys for that. We had a couple questions over on TikTok, so I'm going to quickly get to those. Alan wants to know, can AROYA help growers with pest control? I'm having spider mites.
Document what your pesticide management system looks like. In AROYA specifically, if you have AROYA, use the pesticide management features in there. Make sure that your employees are doing a good job logging it and taking pictures. All right, well, where did the spider mites begin? Did they come from the leaky door over in the back right side? Maybe it's something that we need to address some maintenance concerns. Like I said earlier as well, preventative maintenance is by far the best way. It's the easiest way, the least expensive way to help, control any type of pest infestations. So that's our advice.
Yeah, utilize your task management tools to make sure that your pest inspections, your scouting, everything's getting taken care of. And then, adding pictures, just general, not only crop, but facility registration. Like, oh, hey, yeah, we got a crack in this wall between the two rooms over here. We've got, a lot of different grow facilities have their own unique issues, whether it's, doors sealing up, just like you mentioned, simple things, or sometimes more complicated things like, hey, we've got this crack in the foundation that apparently is letting things in from outside, But if you don't document everything, it's hard to look back quantitatively, especially when you're in a situation where you're walking around and going like, oh man, there they are again. There they are again. It day to day gets pretty repetitive and tough to look back and say, okay, yeah, we got those when we took in these cuts, or hey, I'll say something mean here, but I've seen it happen before. We hired someone who grows at their house, and ever since then, now we've got aphids and spider mites and, just keeping track of everything so you can really when you do put in the time to try to track it, you actually are successful.
And, just think about, and kind of adding on to what Seth was saying, where did the source of that infestation come from? Was it our environmental factors that are promoting that type of pest to grow? Is it something like in our area right now, we have an incredible wheat crop coming down, which means that the natural habitat of a lot of those pests is now going away, and they're looking for my nice warm greenhouse with a bunch of tasty cannabis plants to be chewing on. And every year right now, it's a struggle to keep things like spider mites down in the greenhouses in this area, at least.
Oh yeah, spider mites, green peach aphids. I mean, unfortunately, cannabis suffers from a lot of the same pests that pretty much most commercially cultivated crops do as well. So, when you're in, and as this whole industry moves forward, a lot of growers are going out, and doing this in rural areas, and they're surrounded by other agriculture. it's just a reality that we've got to live with, you know. And one cool thing about that, though, is like I'll use the green peach aphids around here as an example. Whatever field you're close to, when they spray it, they're going to come in. When they chop it, they're going to come in. But it's pretty predictable. You go, hey, they're cutting the wheat, so we're going to spray for aphids in the rooms that we can, and then have a good program for the next month or two till it gets cold finally, and then the aphids are done for the season.
Thank you guys for that. I'm going to close out the TikTok questions. Selena wants to know, I sprouted in water and now they aren't growing in soil. Do we have any advice for that?
That could be a lot of things. Typically, overwatering in dirty soil will damp off a plant, and that's where it just kind of stops growing, shrivels up, and dies. And that's a bacterial infection. Yeah. Or our good old friend mold, Aspergillus.
Yeah, or not keeping up with the light needs of the plant as it is maturing. You know, obviously germinating in dark and water. And when you're going into something like soil, make sure that those soil conditions are as preferable as possible. So if you can, take an EC and a pH reading of that soil. Those are probably going to be some of the easiest things to look at. Try and troubleshoot some issues like that.
Good luck out there. We have one question from Instagram. This is a great one to close us out today. Thank you all for your incredible questions. What a great conversation this has been. Humboldt Official wrote in, hey guys, I had a question for you. What is the highest gram per square foot you feel comfortable saying you can help a greenhouse cultivator reach? We plan on doing a facility upgrade soon and would like to partner with someone who can help us achieve our biggest yield possible without sacrificing quality. We think you could help us reach that goal. What are your thoughts on that, guys?
In a well-manufactured greenhouse with some pretty high-quality growers that are very dedicated to what they're doing, I would say that 70 to 80 grams per square foot of high-quality product would be an A plus type growing situation. As equipment does get better and people do learn how to operate their control parameters to begin to mimic an even less variable environment, I think we'll see those numbers continue to go up.
Yeah, that's right in the realm of what I'm seeing from people who are nailing it in greenhouses right now. And there are people that are running higher, but typically that comes with, how would I put it? More and more expensive hybrid growing greenhouses. So if you've got a greenhouse that is very, very, very high tech with incredible cooling capabilities and incredible supplemental light and everything else.
CO2 for sure.
And CO2, that's the big one. Once you've got a sealed system with recirculating air inside and you're recycling your air, you're pumping CO2, that's when we're going to see those big yields. But that 60 to 90 range is usually pretty achievable in most greenhouses, pending your ability to control your VPD. So there might be times of the year, like for us around here, particularly the spring and the fall, we see greenhouse yields go down just because we can't maintain that VPD quite as easily. Or if we want to, we're going to be spending a lot more money on energy to keep that up. I mean, that's been my experiences. Once the temperature goes down and the rain starts here in the Northwest, you're burning that heater a lot in the greenhouse, and that's just the reality of it. But if you have a well-designed system and you can keep up with the climatic differences in your region throughout the year, 80 grams is a very solid number to start at. And typically we see people coming in greenhouses, anywhere from that 20 to 45 range before they start crop steering, I would say is really average. And a lot of times by the time they come to us, they've been wrestling a lot of other equipment in their greenhouse. So once they've got the sensor, the confidence in their sensors that they can then, calibrate all the other sensors in their greenhouse too, they're really able to take it to the next level.
Amazing. Thank you, guys. And as always, the best way to learn more about AROYA is to book a demo. So feel free to reach out to us if you want to learn more about what AROYA can do. Seth and Jason, incredible. Yet another jam-packed, knowledge-packed episode. Thank you so much for sharing the knowledge with us. And of course, Mandy, this is me and you. Thank you for holding it down with me. Thanks to everybody who joined us for this week's office hours. We do this every Thursday. And as you can tell, the best way to get answers from the experts is to join us live. But as always, let us know if there's a topic you'd like covered in a future episode. Post it in the chat, shoot us an email at support.aroya@metergroup.com, or send us an Instagram DM or TikTok. We are on there now. And either way, we want to hear from you. We record every session. We'll email everyone in attendance a link to the video from today's discussion. It'll also live on the AROYA YouTube channel. Like, subscribe, and share while you're there. And if you find these conversations helpful, please feel free to share them with your network. Spread the word. Thank you all so much, and we will see you next time. Bye.